The wilderness has always kept its secrets. For centuries, people have whispered about what hides beyond the fog, about the shapes that move between the trees when no one's watching. Most call them legends, others, lies. But every legend begins somewhere, and every lie hides a fragment of truth. In the remote valleys of northern British Columbia, where the mist never lifts and silence hangs heavy over the pines, an aging hunter named Frank Dalton lived alone. He trusted the rhythm of the wild more than the word of any man. To him, nature was honest even when it was cruel. But that winter morning, as frost clung to the barbed wire and his breath fogged in the cold air, Frank stumbled upon something that would unravel everything he thought he knew about the forest. Two small creatures, wounded, trembling, their cries cutting through the stillness like whispers from another world. They weren't animals, and they weren't human. What began as an act of mercy soon became a confrontation with the unknown, one that would blur the line between man and myth, between fear and compassion. Because deep in those woods, a mother was searching for her lost children. And when the fog rose, nothing in Frank's quiet world would ever be the same again. They were tangled in a barbed wire fence, their tiny bodies trembling as they struggled weakly. Their faint cries drifted through the cold morning air. Covered in coarse fur, yet revealing eyes that seemed unmistakably human eyes, filled with fear and pain, they were unlike anything he had ever seen. His instincts told him to walk away, but compassion told him to stay. What he chose to do next would test his courage, his beliefs, and everything he thought he knew about the wilderness. Frank Dalton, 61 years old, was a retired wildlife hunter who had spent most of his life in the lonely, frozen valleys of northern British Columbia. He lived alone in a small log cabin surrounded by pine forests and open fields, where the mist seemed to cling to the earth even at midday. For most people, it was too remote, too quiet. But Frank preferred it that way. He trusted the rhythm of nature more than the noise of men. Years of tracking wolves, bears, and moose had shaped him into a patient, practical man. He spoke little, worked hard, and knew every inch of the land within 50 miles better than anyone else. The few neighbors he had respected him, though they rarely came by. Frank liked it that way. Just him, his old dog, and the wilderness. But lately, something felt off. A few fences around his property had been torn apart, and two of his neighbors' goats had gone missing. At the general store, people whispered about strange, towering shapes seen moving along the ridgeline at night. Too big for bears, they said. Too quiet for moose. Frank didn't believe a word of it. He had heard tales of strange creatures in the woods his whole life, but to him, there was always a simpler answer: weather, predators, or plain human carelessness. Still, there was something about that fence that bothered him. The claw marks were too deep, the spacing between them too wide. He told himself he'd check it again in the morning, just another problem to fix, nothing more. The next morning broke gray and bitterly cold, the kind of chill that seeped straight into his bones before the sun could warm the valley. Frank started up his old ATV. The engine coughed and sputtered before roaring to life. He drove down toward the lower pasture, where the fence had been torn apart during the night. A heavy fog blanketed the field, turning the world into a moving canvas of silver and white. Frank slowed to a crawl, eyes scanning the fence line. Halfway along, he spotted deep gouges carved into one of the wooden posts, long, heavy scratches that looked like they'd been made by something far stronger than a bear. Nearby, the barbed wire hung loose, twisted as if it were soft metal. Frank climbed off the ATV and crouched beside the wire. Caught in the barbs was a tuft of dark brown hair, coarse, long, and thicker than any animal fur he'd ever trapped. He rolled it between his fingers. It didn't match any species he knew. Then he heard it. A faint, broken sound carried through the fog, a soft whimper. At first, he thought it might be an injured deer tangled somewhere in the fence. He followed the noise carefully, boots crunching on the frozen ground. The sound came again, thin and fragile, like the cry of a child. Frank's heartbeat quickened. He stopped beside a section of bent wire near the far edge of the field. The noise was louder, now clearer. Not a deer, not a wolf. Whatever it was, the voice trembled with emotion. He swallowed hard and stepped through the fog, unsure what he was about to find, but certain it wasn't anything he'd seen before. The mist thinned just enough for him to glimpse movement near the fence line. At first, He thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Then the shapes became clear. Two small figures, both trapped in the twisted barbed wire, struggling weakly against the sharp metal that held them fast. Frank froze, stunned. The creatures stood about 4 feet tall, their bodies covered in thick, glossy brown-black fur that shimmered faintly in the morning light. Their arms and legs were caught in the barbs, deep gashes marking where the wire had bitten into flesh. One whimpered softly, a sound that broke his heart, too close to a child's cry. The other, slightly larger, turned its head toward him. Its face, half human, half animal, was streaked with blood and dirt. Tiny, jet-black eyes locked onto his. It let out a trembling growl, weak and defensive, more frightened than threatening. Frank couldn't move. For a long moment he just stood there, frozen between fear and disbelief. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to leave these things alone. He didn't know what they were, or how dangerous they might be. But then he saw the smaller one reach for the other, its tiny hand trembling, unable to move because the wire cut deep into its wrist. Something inside him shifted. He wasn't looking at monsters. He was looking at two terrified, helpless beings in pain. Frank slowly lowered his rifle, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Easy now," he whispered, more to calm himself than to comfort them. And in that instant, he knew whatever they were, he couldn't just walk away. "They're alive," he told himself. "They're hurting, and they need help." He cut the power running through the fence and cautiously stepped closer. The air grew tense, not because of the wire, but because of the two frightened creatures watching his every move. The metal creaked softly as he reached out, and somewhere between fear and compassion, Frank Dalton's world quietly changed forever. The larger one bared its small, sharp teeth and hissed a thin, piercing sound that cut through the morning air, while the smaller creature whimpered, a pitiful, trembling noise that made Frank's chest tighten. He crouched low, speaking softly, his voice steady and calm. "Easy now, I'm not going to hurt you." The tone was instinctive, the same gentle, grounded voice he'd used years ago to free trapped prairie wolves or soothe wounded deer. One slow step at a time, he closed the distance. The young Bigfoots huddled close together, their trembling bodies pressed against one another, wide eyes reflecting fear and confusion. Only now did Frank see just how deeply the barbed wire had bitten into them. It was wrapped tight, cutting through fur and into flesh, leaving long, dark streaks of dried blood down their legs. He pulled on his thick gloves, took a pair of wire cutters from his belt, and went to work. The first snip made the smaller one jerk violently, but Frank said nothing. He just kept moving slowly, carefully, one wire at a time. Each cut was followed by quiet, almost meaningless words, murmured softly enough to show he meant no harm. After several tense minutes, he freed the first creature's leg. It didn't try to run, it only lay there, panting, shivering from cold and exhaustion. The second one was in worse shape, its arm twisted unnaturally in the fence, caught so tightly the metal had begun to bite to the bone. Frank's breath fogged in the freezing air as he worked. Finally, with one last sharp snap, the wire gave way. The creature collapsed onto the frosty grass, trying to crawl, but its limbs gave out beneath it. It let out a weak, broken sound, half groan, half sigh before slumping motionless onto the ground. Frank knelt beside them both. Their breathing was shallow, ragged, their eyes fluttered shut. "You won't make it out here," he murmured under his breath. He shrugged off his old flannel jacket and grabbed a thick wool blanket from the back of his ATV. One by one, he lifted the small, heavy bodies into his arms. They were denser than he expected, solid and surprisingly heavy beneath their thick fur. He laid them gently in the trailer, covered them with another blanket, and started the engine. The rumble made them stir weakly, but they didn't resist. As he drove toward the cabin, one question kept echoing in his mind. "God help me. What have I just brought home?" Frank pushed the cabin door open with his shoulder, careful not to jostle the small bundle in his arms. Warm air brushed against his face as the embers in the fireplace sprang to life under a quick stir of the poker. He laid the two creatures down on an old rug near the hearth and wrapped them snugly in blankets. The cabin filled with the mingled scent of smoke, pine, and wet fur. The smaller one, the same that had hissed before, blinked weakly now, gazing up at him with eyes both weary and startlingly intelligent. The other, still unconscious, breathed in shallow gasps. its fur matted with blood and dirt. Frank moved quietly around the cabin, gathering supplies, a first aid kit, clean water, and a small metal basin. He wasn't a doctor, but years of tending to injured animals had taught him patience and care. His hands, steady and deliberate, washed away the blood and debris, removing bits of wire still tangled in their fur. They whimpered, but didn't fight him. When he dabbed antiseptic on one of the deeper cuts, the smaller one let out a faint cry, a sound so raw it tore through him. "Easy, easy there," Frank whispered. "Almost done." His voice, low, warm, and steady, seemed to calm them. When he handed the alert one a tin cup of water, it stared at the cup for a long moment before awkwardly mimicking him, lifting it with both hands and spilling half on its chest before drinking the rest. Frank nearly smiled. Despite the fear and the strangeness of it all, something electric and unfamiliar stirred in his chest. In their eyes, he didn't see monsters. He saw confusion, pain, and a fragile spark of trust. He sank into a chair beside the fire, staring into the flames. "Who are you?" he whispered. The only reply was the quiet crackle of the fire and the soft, rhythmic breathing behind him. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Pale daylight crept through the cabin windows. The two small creatures, bandaged, warmed, and still under his watchful eye, began to move with more strength. At first, they stayed near the corner by the stove, cautious but curious. Then, slowly, they began to explore. Frank sat silently, watching in disbelief as one of them picked up his coffee mug, sniffed it, then tried a sip, instantly grimacing at the bitter taste. The other reached for his old binoculars, turning them clumsily in its small hands, fascinated by the lenses and reflections. When Frank raised his hand and pointed to himself, the smaller one tilted its head, then pressed a hand to its chest and uttered a small, uncertain sound. "Frank." The second one followed, repeating the same sound in a rasping attempt to match the tone. Frank froze, staring. They weren't just mimicking him, they were trying to communicate. Over the next few minutes, they copied more of his gestures, patting their chests, pointing toward the fire, even attempting a faint imitation of his laugh when he couldn't help but chuckle softly in amazement. In their eyes, he saw understanding, curiosity, recognition. Frank leaned back in his chair, his breath unsteady. "You're not animals," he murmured. "You're something else entirely." And then, the fragile quiet of the cabin shattered. From deep within the forest came a low, rumbling roar, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It rolled through the valley, primal and vast, making the air itself tremble. The young ones stiffened instantly, their ears twitching, eyes wide with alarm. Frank stood, heart pounding, staring toward the window. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. Whatever was out there wasn't just big. It was coming straight for them. The night outside went unnaturally still, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums right before something terrible happens. Then came the first crack in the distance, another, and then the forest began to move. The sound of snapping branches echoed across the valley like distant gunfire. Under the porch, Frank's old hunting dog whimpered softly, hackles raised. Frank grabbed his rifle and a flashlight, pushing out into the cold night. The beam cut through the mist, slicing silver paths through the fog. Somewhere beyond the tree line, something was moving. At first, it looked like a shadow drifting between the trunks. Then it stopped. The outline that emerged was enormous, so vast that the flashlight's beam barely grazed the edge of its form. Broad shoulders, long, powerful arms hanging low, the silhouette of something easily 10 feet tall. Two dim amber eyes stared back at him from the dark. Frank froze, breath locked in his throat. The creature released a deep, resonant sound, not a roar, not a snarl, but something mournful, aching, almost like a call. The low vibration rolled through the ground beneath his boots. Then, from inside the cabin, came an answering cry, soft, frightened, familiar, the young one's. Frank's pulse hammered in his ears. He turned back toward the cabin just as the cries grew louder, frantic now, rising in pitch, as if responding to the voice outside. He swung the flashlight back toward the trees. The figure was moving closer now, slowly, deliberately. The mother, her posture was cautious, her movement deliberate. And in her glowing eyes, Frank saw not rage, but desperate searching. The hunter in him told him to stand his ground, but the man who had just saved her children hesitated. "She's looking for them," he whispered to himself. And in that instant, Frank realized he was facing the hardest choice of his life. If the local hunters saw her, they'd shoot her without hesitation. But if he didn't act fast, she might tear through everything in her path to get her young back. One way or another, something was about to happen. By dawn, the fog still hung thick over the valley when Frank heard the low rumble of a truck coming up the road. Two local hunters, Pete and Lyle, climbed out, rifles slung across their shoulders. Their faces were drawn, uneasy. "Something big tore apart a bull moose up on the ridge," Pete said grimly. "Bones scattered everywhere like kindling." "You seen anything strange, Frank?" Frank kept his voice steady. "Just wolves, maybe a bear passing through." But his pulse thudded against his ribs. The memory of those amber eyes was still fresh, burned into him. Lyle kicked at the damp earth near the shed. "Bears don't just leave like that," he muttered. Both men knelt to examine the ground. In the mud, half filled with rainwater, were tracks massive, twice the size of a man's boot. Frank shrugged. Soft ground, could be stretched out by runoff. The two hunters exchanged a wary look. "We'll come back tonight," Pete said finally. "If it's still roaming, we'll find it." They drove off, their truck disappearing into the mist, dust trailing behind like smoke. Frank stood there, silent, staring at the tree line. He knew the mother would return, and if those men saw her first, there'd be blood. Inside the cabin, the two small creatures stirred beneath their blankets. "I won't let them hurt you," he whispered. He sat by the fire, the glow painting soft orange light across the log walls. The young ones huddled together, eyes heavy with exhaustion. One reached out a trembling hand, touching the toe of his boot, a small, wordless gesture of trust. Frank's throat tightened. Keeping them meant risking everything, his home, his life, even theirs. Their mother was out there, desperate, and the hunters would be back with guns and flashlights. He couldn't let that happen. He exhaled slowly, his resolve hardening in the still air. "You don't belong here," he murmured. "You belong with her." He pulled two old wool blankets from the closet and wrapped each of the young creatures carefully. The morning fog had thickened, swallowing the trees in shifting gray. Frank lifted them into the truck, settling them gently on the back seat, making sure they were warm and still. The old engine coughed to life. He took one last look at his cabin, the place that had kept him safe for years, then turned down the narrow dirt road that wound deep into the forest. He didn't know exactly where he was going, only that he had to reach her before the hunters did. After nearly an hour, Frank stopped by a narrow stream. The truck's engine ticked softly in the cool morning air. The forest around him was unnervingly silent. No birds, no wind, only the quiet trickle of water breaking the stillness. Then came a deep rumble, low, guttural, resonating through his chest. She stepped from the shadows. The mother, Bigfoot, towering, over 3 meters tall. Her fur was soaked black from the rain, hanging heavy against powerful shoulders. Her amber eyes glowed faintly under the dim light, and though she moved with immense power, her gaze held no hatred, only fierce, steady purpose. Frank froze, every muscle taut. The two small ones stirred in the truck bed, then suddenly leapt down, crying out in high, piercing voices that shattered the forest silence. The giant mother dropped to her knees, arms outstretched, a deep, throaty sound rising from her chest. The little ones rushed to her, pressing against her fur. She inspected their wounds, then leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently against theirs in a strange, tender gesture that made Frank's throat tighten. He lowered his rifle slowly to the ground and stepped back. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't a monster. This was a mother. The forest fell silent again, save for the soft babble of the stream and the faint breaths of the three beings before him. The mother turned her gaze toward Frank. Her amber eyes shimmered faintly through the fog, not predatory, but perceptive, searching. She stepped closer, the earth trembling beneath her weight. Frank didn't move. He only watched, heart pounding, his rifle forgotten at his side. Then a low, resonant sound escaped her throat, deep and deliberate. It wasn't a growl, it was something formed, something spoken. A word, a message, one he couldn't understand, but felt deep in his bones. She crouched, reached down to the muddy bank and lifted a small, smooth stone. Its surface was carved with intricate symbols, delicate and deliberate, worn by time. With a slow, careful motion, she tossed it at his feet. Frank stared down at the stone, realizing it was not just a token, but a message, perhaps a gift, perhaps a warning, perhaps both. When he looked up again, the clearing was empty. The fog had swallowed her and her children with complete and solemn silence, as though the forest itself had closed its mouth. All that remained was the murmur of the stream and the cold carved stone lying at his boots. The fog never truly left that valley. Even years later, Frank Dalton could still remember the sound, the deep, trembling call that had rolled through the forest like thunder from another age. The morning he saw her, the mother changed him forever. He never told the hunters what he'd seen. He never showed them the carved stone, or spoke of the night he stood face to face with something that wasn't a beast, but a mother trying to protect her own. To the rest of the world, he remained just another old man living alone in the woods. But to him, the forest was no longer silent. It breathed, it watched, it remembered. Sometimes, on cold mornings when the mist drifted low across the fields, Frank would step outside his cabin and swear he heard movement beyond the trees, soft footsteps, a low hum, the echo of something familiar. And though he never saw them again, he always left a blanket and a tin cup of water by the fence, just in case. Because deep down, Frank knew the truth that most people spend their whole lives trying to deny that the world is wider, wilder, and far more mysterious than we dare to believe. Somewhere beyond the fog, where the pines whisper and the river runs cold, a mother and her children still roam, and the man who once saved them keeps their secret held close to his heart, like the forest holds its own. And maybe that's how it's meant to be. Not every secret needs to be found. Some are meant to stay hidden, until the world is ready to listen.